workshop. Just going to start off a few housekeeping rules before we start. We had planned to try and make this session as interactive as possible, but it was a little bit more popular than we thought it would be. So with so many numbers, it makes it a little bit more difficult. But so just to, we will mute your audio during the session just to keep it quiet. As you can hear now, the session is being recorded. You can submit questions via the chat as we go, and the slides will be shared with you after by email. And we're going to have a short Slido at the end for a little bit of feedback and a Q&A session. So I think we're going to try and keep the presentations to about 35, 40 minutes so we have enough time for chat at the end. So what we plan to do today is just take you through the process that we have been using to develop our projects. The structure we'll show you and the supporting documents will all be made available on our website within the next few weeks. We just have to put the finishing touches to everything. So today we will discuss the kind of broad stages that we'll work through. So I'm going to start off by just giving a short, maybe 5-minute introduction to DeliveREE and for some background and some context. Then Grania will take you through the idea of using a kind of the portfolio approach and looking at gap to targets and the organization wide pathways. Then we'll discuss project appraisal, which is kind of the energy audit or the decarbonisation report. Then we will go into the project business case and discuss a little bit around pathfinder funding. And then we will touch on procurement and a little bit around the value for money. And then finally, just a quick touch on the kind of detailed design and then into Q&A. So first, I'd like to start by introducing Kadima. We're the energy advisors to the Dublin local authorities. We're founded in 1997 as a not-for-profit, and now there's 35 is based in the digital hub. We offer services in energy planning, policy and research, public sector obligations, engagement, funding and facilitation, and then the cell that myself and Grania are part of, it's the large scale project rollout. The DeliveREE project started back in 2021 when we applied for what was at the time the last round of the Horizon 2020 project development assistance funding. This has now moved to the LIFE program, but the project had 3 main goals, and that was to create a project implementation unit, to create a delivery model that could be replicated, which is part of the process today, and also to test that model and make sure it's realistic by using it to deliver contracts within the project timeframe. We had quite a strong partnership made up of ourselves, Kadima. We had Resourceful Futures, who are a legal and commercial consultancy from the UK. We'd Philip Lee Solicitors here based in Dublin. We had Sustainable Development Capital Limited from bringing in private finance expertise with offices both in London and Dublin. And then we had the 4 Dublin local authorities, Dublin City, Dún Laoghaire, Fingal, and South Dublin. And then within the project timeline, we expanded that to include the Mid-East local authorities, which was Wicklow, Meath, Kildare, and Louth. So the project had an initial target of 20.4 million of investment. And of this investment, half was to come from the private sector. So that's not private sector projects, but actually will private sector investment in public sector projects. So I realize that can be a bit confusing there, the way it's presented. So the idea is that we would trigger the project development assistance is all about triggering or unlocking project development, getting projects from ideas to actually sign contracts. So, and that's where the focus is on the investment. And within that, we had a target of 24 gigawatt hours of energy savings and just under 4,000 tons of CO2. So as of today, we have awarded 21 million euro in contracts, mainly with South Dublin, Meath and Kildare, generally with leisure centres and large office buildings. Of this, there's just under 3 million been coming in from the ESCOs. That's our private investment. We have achieved 15.5 gigawatt hours of energy savings and 2,797 tons of CO2. little bit short on the energy and the CO2 at the moment, mainly because the initial targets were set based on energy efficiency measures across 140 buildings. But what we have delivered to date has been a much deeper decarbonisation of 28 buildings. So we have quite a strong pipeline then going into 2026, where potentially up to 46 million at least by, well, probably mid 2027 at this stage. But that'll bring us up to close to 30 gigawatt hours of energy savings and just under 6,300 tons of CO2. So the delivery model, which we're going to discuss today, really is designed to be used with what we would term as decarbonisation projects as opposed to deep retrofit. And the kind of distinction here, and a very blunt distinction or a simplified distinction here, is that we would consider deep retrofit projects to be a building site, essentially, where you're going to shut down a building, and decarbonisation to be working on a live building. So the first step in the model, as Claudia will discuss in a moment, is to kind of gap to target analysis to prioritize your buildings. And this kind of looking at your portfolio helps to separate out what will be potential deep retrofit projects and what are decarbonisation. And the assumption here is that every building portfolio will have a small number of asset renewal or deep retrofit projects every year. And these are very much more suited to the traditional architect-led design team or design team-led project development model, but there'll only be a very small number of these in any portfolio in any one year. And then it's what do we do with all the rest of the buildings? And this is where we see we should be focusing on decarbonisation, and this is where the delivery model comes into play. A core element of the delivery model is the project implementation unit. So this unit concentrates the technical, commercial, and procurement expertise. It allows building owners to participate without having to manage complex process individually. It provides a support structure for internal staff, and it standardized project development and procurement. So the PIU team within Kadima at the moment is a team of 6, but there's 4 of us dedicated to EPC. And essentially what we're going to discuss today or bring you through is the process we use as a team to develop these projects. How does the model work? Very quickly, and this is a kind of we didn't start off with this model 5 years ago. This is kind of what has emerged out of a process of trial and error of testing different ideas and different approaches to aggregating buildings, to bringing in performance contracting, to try and understand ideas like deep retrofit versus decarbonisation, all of that. So the first step is to review, look at a building portfolio, all of the buildings within an organisation, and in the public sector, that's very much focused around the gap to target. And identifying your most significant users, and then maybe identifying those projects that are kind of at asset renewal and where lots of other factors other than energy efficiency and decarbonisation come into play. Once you have those, that kind of is the first simplification really, and then you have I should have a reasonably large group of buildings, and then the idea here is to separate these into large buildings and everything else, kind of applying the 80-20 rule. So what are your significant energy users? What are those buildings that are going to help you hit your targets? And for those ones, we set up a framework of EPC contractors, and we just use EPC for these. And these are typically 8-year contracts. In what we've done to date, it doesn't have to be that. Type of value we're seeing is like 5 to 10 million euro. And we have a mini competition using competitive dialogue for each one of these, and that's what we will discuss today. And as an example of this, where we have this up and running, is with the Mid East Energy Unit, which is the 4 Dublin local authorities, or the full 4 local authorities are Wicklow, Meath, Kildare, and Louth. They come together as the Mid East. And for example, they have 12 buildings that are significant. They're mainly the leisure centres and the county halls. But then we don't want to just stop there. We need the majority of buildings then are what we would call smaller buildings in terms of decarbonisation and energy consumption. And for these, we've set up a separate framework which is based around an energy guarantee model or a design, build, and commission. And these will be agreements. There'll be 2 years kind of commissioning guarantee, and they're smaller value projects. And this crucially operates on a cascade system, which helps really simplify the procurement. So we've set up a framework here. The difference with this framework is that contractor in number one position essentially gets first offer of every project. And we have 40 buildings approximately in this framework. So those two frameworks kind of take care of the whole portfolio of buildings for those four local authorities in that case. I've mentioned performance contracting there and energy guarantees. We also have kind of what I would say in the main family of performance contracts. We have full-on EPC, energy guarantees, which is kind of a lighter version of that, and then you have supply contracts, and they're generally the contracts we focus on in terms of decarbonisation. The graphic here also helps to show the relationships, how they're kind of restructured between the contractor and the subcontractors. Performance contracts are basically a kind of form of design, build, operate, and maintain. And you can see here what we're really doing is bringing the design, the installation, the service and maintenance all under the one umbrella. And so that it's kind of one offering, so that the contract relationships are almost in between as opposed to all individually to the building owner. And then crucially, you can see here this role of what I've called here the EPC facilitator, or this is also the project implementation unit team. And they're the kind of a go-between, but really just helping to really very much on the side of the client, but helping to interact and work with the market as well and make sure that projects are realized. Okay. So stepping into how we develop projects, this chart shows an overview of the project development structure, or the protocol as we are calling it. The idea, like what we will publish is this protocol, and then each project stage has its own procedure that must be followed. And you can see here on we're aligning with the SCAI groups project stages and also the infrastructure guidelines. But the main focus here are the individual project stages. And we kind of have a section today touching on each one of these. You can see that there's some key decision points. So after you've had your appraisal and your project initiation or your project business case, the building owner or client has a key decision point then of whether they proceed to procurement or whether they take an alternative route or split up the project. If they go forward, then you have another key point after procurement at contract signing stage, and then again when you get on and through detailed design in proceeding to works. So that's those. If we look at the actual sheet, is quite a big, large Excel sheet at the moment. It will hopefully be in some sort of fancy database in the future, but at the moment this works quite well. What crucially you can see here is that we have a RASI matrix for all the people involved. This is very important. And this first sheet brings us up to contract signing. And you can see here in the first column, you have the various project stages, and then we have the kind of each procedure said. Most importantly, what you have is either the PIU or the local authority or the client basically leading at this stage up to contract signing. And then when you go into the second stage, you can see you're after contract signing, and then you're into develop design, detailed design, and works. And here it's very much the ESCO that takes over as lead, and you also have the involvement of the energy efficiency design consultant and a cost consultant coming in there as well. I suppose just these are still works in progress. It's a system that we're continuously looking to improve. So if you have feedback on the process yourself, we're always welcome or always open to it. And then I'm going to hand you over to Grania now, who's going to take you through the first section, which is the kind of organization-wide pathway or the gap to target. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi everyone, and thanks for joining this morning. So if you want to just flick on to the next slide, Joe, I'm going to talk through this first stage, the organisation-wide decarbonisation pathway. So I suppose for people who are joining from local authorities or other public sector organisations, you'll be very familiar with the 2030 targets that apply to your organisation and the gap to target tool that was developed by SCAI that you can then download, and it will have all your information that you've been uploading to their system for the last couple of years. So this organisation-wide decarbonisation pathway, we also kind of call it the gap to target stage. So when I say gap to target, you might be asking yourself which target, because there are three of them. We have the energy efficiency target, the total CO2, as well as the direct emissions. So I suppose all three are relevant, but the one we tend to focus on is that third one, the direct emissions. So that's thermal and transport, and we focus on that one, I suppose, because it's the most challenging one to meet. And if you're taking actions to meet that target, you will, by extension, make progress on the other two as well. So thermal and transport, that's referring to, you can leave that, Joe, you can flick on. Thanks. Thermal and transport is referring to obviously gas heating systems, as well as maybe a small number of kerosene heating systems in local authorities. And then transport in terms of the diesel and petrol used in your fleet. So I suppose we are here this morning to talk about building decarbonisation, but because of that target for public sector organisations, there is conversation to be had first in terms of that balance between buildings and transport. So if your organisation has none or maybe only a small number of light vehicles, it's reasonably straightforward to electrify those. But I suppose our experience working with the local authorities is they have a very large fleet with a real variety in vehicle types. So while they, have and are continuing to make a lot of progress electrifying the lighter vehicles, there is a number of heavier vehicles. So things like, the road gritters, tractors that they have a lot of that are quite difficult to electrify. So where there's shortcomings in transport, that has to be made up for in buildings. So that's then when we come across to the right side, which is when the delivery process kicks in, where we're looking at the building portfolio of the organisation. So as Joe mentioned, what we do here is say, to piggyback off the gap to target system, take the information and the list of buildings you have from that, as well as the consumption, and then group that into three or even just two lists. One being your large buildings and the other being your medium and small buildings. So in your own organization, you'll probably know how to kind of what the threshold for whether a building is large or medium is. Working with local authorities would do maybe energy spend. So a large building would have an annual energy spend of over maybe 100 grand a year. So that's something like a leisure centre. A medium building, maybe somewhere like a fire station, you'd be between 20 and 90 grand a year of an energy spend. And then the smaller buildings would be less than 20 grand a year. It might be something like a community centre. The next stage then, when you have those lists, it'll become kind of clear, I suppose, in terms of where do we need to concentrate our measures and projects to see maximum impact towards reaching those targets. And what often is the case, but not always, is this 80/20 rule that Joe mentioned, where we see it's quite common that 80% of the energy use and associated emissions of an organisation are actually coming from just 20% of their building stock. So while your organization might have, 50 buildings in the stock to look after, if you could focus on just the 10 largest ones, you'd be, a long way to meeting the targets. So when you have that short list then of buildings where you're going to concentrate your efforts, it's then a question of how do we remove or at least significantly reduce gas usage at these buildings? And the answer to that question is, I suppose it's a retrofit project, but then is that a deep retrofit project or what we call the decarbonisation retrofit? And Joe has already kind of talked through the difference we see there, that in a deep retrofit, energy isn't the only motivator, and it's a larger asset renewal project. But in a decarbonisation project, I suppose we'd see these buildings are typically what would say maybe mid life cycle. The fabric isn't perfect, but it's in decent condition, and we can't really justify going in and, tearing down large portions of that building because I suppose carbon emissions aside, the building is within reason serving the function that it's meant to. So for those buildings, it is much more of a decarbonisation of the plant room with, M&E heavy measures there with kind of targeted fabric as required. So we know then, I suppose, what we need to do in buildings, and then it's a case of how do we deliver that, and that's setting up the two frameworks that Joe mentioned. So for the small number of deep retrofits you might have, we think the traditional approach is quite well set up to deliver those. And then for those decarbonisation projects, we'd be suggesting that you set up one framework for larger buildings and do those through the EPC, and a second framework for your medium to small buildings, where it's not a full-blown EPC, we'll say, but it still has energy performance guarantees as a central component of the measures you'd be doing. You can move on to the next slide, please, Joe. Thanks. So I've talked about public sector organisations and the gap to target, but I suppose if you're not coming from an organisation like that, the same process is still relevant. It's just that your starting point is going to be different. So if you don't have a target you've been told you have to meet, it's a case of deciding that target. What does success look like for our organisation in terms of building decarbonisation? So that would be the first thing you have to do. And then the second one is a bit trickier in terms of creating a database that you will use to, if you want to actually just flick to the next slide there, Joe. Yeah, so it's the exact same points and process, but before you can do that, you need to create a database that at a minimum would have your building list with some historic consumption information there, because you're going to need that to do the modelling to decide where to concentrate measures and then also to track your progress as the years go on. So it's the exact same points there then on the right that I would have already mentioned, just a different starting point. So if you want to move on to the next slide, Joe. And I think you're actually going to come back here then and
Yeah,
talk about the
that's fine.
next stage, which is appraisal of projects.
Okay, thanks very much, Grania. Yeah, so then moving on through the project stages, the next one is appraisal. Really what we're looking at here is the decarbonisation assessment report. You're starting to maybe have early conversations around procurement and the kind of outcomes you want to get. It's a good idea to really consider all the various stakeholders at this stage, because communication actually is one of the key bits, and often as an engineer, something we often neglect, and that can be very costly in the projects. And then you're looking at an early Pathfinder check-in. But the main element here by far is the decarbonisation assessment report, or basically it's an energy audit, or could be a early starts of an investment grade audit, but really you're looking at an energy audit. We have started in Kadima to kind of focus it more on as a decarbonisation assessment report, more because it's we want to make sure that it has a pathway to zero carbon. So but it's basically the same context as an energy audit. So I won't dwell too much on this. Basically, you're looking at in terms of contents, you're looking at your building overview, your HVAC systems, your building fabric, your lighting, what conditions are they in now, then a reasonably detailed analysis of the energy consumption, your heat and your electricity, BER analysis if you have it, and then most importantly, what can you do to decarbonize that building to get it towards zero carbon? And really all we can do with our buildings at the moment is pretty much electrify them, and then hope that the grid does its part in all of this. So you're going to have energy analysis. You will probably have here some sort of scenario comparison here in this example with the existing system, and then we have a phase with a heat pump, a CHP and PV, and then later on just a different option with just a heat pump and the PV. And then you can see getting towards zero carbon if the grid decarbonizes, and then likewise the same analysis and cost. But most importantly, what you get into is this table here at the end, which gives you your list of potential decarbonization options, the kilowatt hour saved, the gas saved, the carbon, the cost, and the CO2. the reason why this is so important is because this is going to be one of the main inputs into your business case document. And I suppose it's worth pointing out here at this stage, if in these projects that we're putting together in our example, we will normally have two, three, four, possibly even up to have six buildings within a pool. So you should have an appraisal report for every building, I think, and that's your options. So once you have your appraisal report complete, and if people are happy with the outcomes and they see good opportunities there, and you probably, you're going to have some check-in with clients there, then the next stage then is to move into this project initiation phase. And this involves a number of stages. Things are starting to get a little bit more serious. So the very first one you can see here is market engagement. So it's really a good idea to go out and talk to contractors before you go to procurement, before you get into all of that, just to engage to see if there's sufficient interest in your project before you go to market, especially if you're going to try something that might be novel, such as some sort of energy supply, energy performance, energy guarantee contract, where you're pushing more risk onto them. Um, then next, you want to be really at this stage considering temporary metering or permanent metering if possible, but you very important to get good data, good baseline data that can save a lot of arguments and discussions later on. Um, Surveys are also another important aspect here. Um, Particularly, if you have concerns about the roof structure, or you might have concerns about the electrical system. Basically, you want to see at this stage, are there any potential showstoppers? Are there something there that's going to push this into a much bigger capital asset renewal type project? You might as well find out soon. Um, then just skipping ahead, then you have the team establishment. So who is it that you're going to be working with on the client side? Who are the decision makers? Who's going to help this project proceed to procurement? You mightn't have much control over this, but you want to be asking those questions and getting that structure in place, because we'll see after governance is important. Grania is going to come back in a few minutes and talk about the Pathfinder element, but I think besides Pathfinder, which is obviously extremely important if you're in the public sector and bringing 50% funding, the main document and the main output of this whole project initiation project is this appraisal report, or what I would call the project business case. So this document it's basically the business case is what management will use when making the decision to proceed to procurement. So earlier when we showed those traffic lights, that's a key point. So this is a critical point in the project, whether you're going to proceed, especially if you're considering something like EPC, proceed as planned, or else where you might actually say, no, we're going to break this up into a group of smaller projects, or we're going to go out and get a design-led team, or that could be part of the business case as well. So in what is it, business case? Well, if we look at the table of contents here again, obviously the executive summary, but if we skip to two, you've got the project justification. So remembering that, why do you need to do the project? How does it align with policy, national and local? What are the strategic needs? What's the value for money possibility? Then you're going into the project scope. So, and the project scope, this information is coming from your decarbon assessment reports. So if you have three buildings, as in this example, you'll have three different projects, three different numbers feeding in here, and or you're basically bringing all these as measures together and presenting them, the scope of works, the objectives, crucially what's out of scope, can almost more important what's in scope, and then how you're going to manage performance and measurement. Then following on from that, you're into financial appraisal. So again, this is from that table at the end of your decarbonisation assessment. You're getting all your capital figures, all your saving figures. You're bringing them in. You're going to do financial analysis. You want to know the net present value over the duration of the life of the equipment. You got to look at funding sources, operation and maintenance costs, financial costs, costs for most importantly the project implementation unit. You got to pay them, and then the affordability and value for money. And then you're into procurement. So what contract are you using and how are you going to procure it? You're looking at the an overview of the procurement, but the objectives, the route selected, your justification for that route, and then the timelines. And then you're getting into governance and risk and management. So this is really important because if you don't have a clear decision-making structure going forward through procurement and all those stage, it really complicates and delays your project. So what are the roles and responsibilities? Who are the decision makers? Who are you reporting to? And who are you working with on a day-to-day basis? Um, so just a couple of highlights here from this report. Oh, just you have the scope of works, setting it out. You've got your procurement overview, the objectives of the procurement process, and then your route selection, whether it's open or restricted or competitive dialogue or negotiation. Just talking through each procedure and justifying your rationale. Then obviously the financial analysis. There's a lot more to it than that, but it's the idea. And then the governance roles and responsibilities. And then possibly most important of all, somebody's signature at the end of it to fall back on in the end, and you can clearly say who approves going forward. And then I'll hand back to Grania now to discuss Pathfinder.
Yeah, you can go into the next slide. Thanks, Joe. So I know we've a mix of people on the call this morning. You may or may not be familiar with the Pathfinder program. So Pathfinder is a funding support program that's administered by SCAI, and it's to support building retrofit projects for public sector organisations, including the local authorities and a number of other organisations, I think like the HSE or the HEA institutions. So I suppose if your organisation can't apply for Pathfinder, I apologise now because the next couple of slides won't be so relevant for you. But there probably is a comparable, funding stream or grant you have in mind where you'd be doing some similar approvals at this stage of the process. So Pathfinder usually provides 50% match funding for the eligible project expenditure. And SCAI have a very detailed document that they'll provide you, which tells you what is and is not considered eligible expenditure. And we applied for Pathfinder at a program level. And what I mean by that is that for the local authorities anyway, they're grouped. So the four Dublin local authorities are grouped together and we prepare all the approval documents kind of in one go and put that suite of documents together to bring for approval to SCAI. And if you just click on Joe. There is the first stage, what I'm going to talk through today, what we call Approval Gate 1. There's four main deliverables that I'm going to go through each one now, if you want to go to the next slide. The first thing we have to do is a state aid assessment for each project. So state aid is essentially making sure that when you're using things like grants or a tax incentive, that there's no negative unintended consequences that would distort competition in the market. So we broadly categorize this into two areas. One for buildings where there is economic activity at that building. So this is things like leisure centres who would have memberships, or theatres is another one we see come up because they might have ticket sales. At these buildings, we have to do a more thorough, we'll say, state aid assessment. And look at some of the kind of the private sector competitors that might be within a 2 or 5 kilometre radius of the building, compared to the other category is where buildings don't have any economic activity. So that's things like fire stations or libraries where there's no private sector competition to these buildings. But for either category, we do have to get, I suppose, a legal opinion to sign off on the template that SEAI give us with about 20 questions where we fill in details of any other funding that the building might have used in previous years, and also some analysis on comparable buildings in the area and explain why the funding wouldn't be considered state aid. So the second deliverable, if you want to flick to the next slide, please, Joe, is the project selection matrix. And this is quite an important one because this is where all the numbers are. So I know the numbers will be quite small on your screen here, but I'll just go through how it's set up. SEAI give us an Excel sheet template, and then I just have one example made up building here. That's why the figures will be so round and ending in zeros. But we are putting in so the building information, looking at things like the year of construction, existing heating systems, floor area. If you press on, Joe. Then they want to see some details on the audit that would have been completed for the building, where we're getting the figures that we put into this sheet. We're looking at the estimated works costs, the baseline, next section, thank you, and then what we expect the energy use to be post-works. From then that we can get the energy savings, and then the sheet is set up to automatically populate what your energy savings will be annually, what the euro invested per kilowatt hour saved will be. And then the interesting ones here at the end are the operational savings and the carbon savings. And you can see there the electricity rate and the fossil fuel rate. You're able to change those rates in the sheet, and it's quite interesting, I suppose, to see that depending on the electricity rate you're putting in there, whether your project is going to have operational savings and at what rate. The other important one then is the carbon savings. So it will calculate your total carbon savings as a percentage of the building's baseline, as well as the euro invested per ton of CO2 saved. But what's important there is that figures at an annual basis rather than the total project, and then a simple payback as well. So I suppose that sheet is set up. It's simple to put the information in. The tricky part is getting all the uh, proper information to use from all the different people on lots of different projects. So the third deliverable then, thanks Joe, if you move on, is the preliminary business case. I think there's two more things that will drop in. Yeah, just one more. Perfect. So the preliminary business case is quite a long document. It's quite dense, to be honest. It's 80 or 90 pages of showing how the program of projects is aligned with the infrastructure guidelines. So you can see the type of content we include there, things like risk assessments, alternative options that were considered. And that list of table of contents there is coming directly from, there's an infrastructure guidelines guidance document on how to prepare a preliminary business case, essentially. So we go into a bit of detail under each of those headings, and there's quite an important appendix at the end, which is the essential and secondary criteria, where we do that by building or by project, and we basically have to make sure we're answering yes or ticking the box for yes to each of the questions that are essential to the Pathfinder program. I have an example there of what one of them looks like in terms of if you're retaining fossil fuel at the site in a bivalent arrangement, it can't be more than 10%. And we've looked at alternatives. And next slide, please, Joe. The last deliverable then for Pathfinder at this stage is essentially just a summary of the previous three. So this is what we bring to the steering group and present and ask for them for approval, and they'll sign off on that. So we're putting in the findings of the state aid assessment, the figures from the project selection matrix, and the kind of summary of alignment with the infrastructure guidelines. The important part at the end of this document is a table where we add all the projects together. We add in VAT and we add in some contingency for things like MIC increases. And it's that bottom line figure that we ask the steering group, who is made up of usually the directors of service of each of the relevant local authorities, as well as SEAI. And we ask them to sign off on that report then. So you can go to the next slide. That is just, I'd say, the first stage of Pathfinder. The money doesn't magically appear in account, unfortunately, once we get through that stage. But I think that's enough to talk through today. And what I'm going to go into next is some of the procurement. So I suppose I've presented Pathfinder just all together because it made sense to do it that way. But it's more realistic that it actually happens more concurrently as we're also going through procurement, not Pathfinder done and then move on to procurement. They happen at the same time, realistically. So if you want to go to the next slide, Joe. The first stage in procurement then is a pre-qualification questionnaire that we'll publish on eTenders. So I've mentioned that we would be, I suppose, recommending always to set up a framework because this is going to save you work in the long run. But if you are an organization where you don't need a framework, it is just one single project you're doing, it would be the same approach in terms of bringing that pre-qualification questionnaire to the to re-tenders. The information that we're looking for, I suppose, in a PQQ, we have a template document now that we put together for delivery, and we're just using the same one, making a few tweaks to make it project specific. But for a tender, the type of information you're submitting is quite standard. The pass-fail requirements, you're giving us some details on things like turnover, insurance, and these are all very much, yes or no. You've ticked the box, you attached the evidence as required. And then the second thing we're looking at is your previous experience, some case studies. So this is a bit more qualitative, I suppose, and we'll set some minimum marks that we need you to achieve here to bring you through to competitive dialogue. And we'd usually set these minimum marks fairly high at maybe 60% or so of the maximum score. So we'd be looking for some, I suppose, relevant experience, some case studies, the organizational capacity of the company, and PM quality control. If you want to move on to the next slide, please, Joe. I suppose we have to do the PQQ, but that also it makes sense that, there's only companies coming through who are able to deliver the outcomes we need because there is quite a bit of work involved in the next stage. So, there's no point wasting both sides people's time bringing companies through who aren't suited to deliver the projects. So the qualifying tenders from the PQQ will move to the next stage, which is the ITP-CD. So I know I'm giving you a lot of abbreviations today, but that's the invitation to participate in competitive dialogue. So at this stage, we will issue you a pack of documents. There should be 4 folders in that. One is the document with the invitation, and that's where we kind of set out the rules of competitive dialogue. And there's, a lot of kind of say disclaimers in that document. The second one is quite important. It's the draft client requirements, and Joe's going to talk a little bit more about that. But essentially, what's in that document is the outcomes that the client wants to get from the project, what they need to have by the end of the tendering process. The third one then is just something that we need tenders to sign if they're coming to site to do a site visit. And the fourth one then, if you move on to the next slide, Joe, we give a technical file for each building, and the bullet points there on the left give you an idea of the type of information we include in that technical file. I suppose I'd summarize it by saying whatever information that we have on those buildings and we can share, we will share in that technical file. At a minimum, you'd be getting consumption data, ideally some floor plans, photos of equipment, any audits. If we have that decarbonisation assessment report Joe mentioned, we'll include that there as well. And yeah, you get it in that kind of folder structure you see below. So from the information we provide in the technical file, along with conducting some site visits to each of the buildings, tenders then prepare an outline solutions report. So obviously can't flash up an example here, unfortunately, because that's something that the tenders prepare. I suppose the type of information we generally see presented in that is an analysis of the existing kind of consumption and activities at the building, the proposal in terms of the equipment that tender is suggesting be installed at the building to meet the client's requirements. They'll give some approximate sizings, the assumptions they're making to propose that equipment, and then there'll be a price breakdown for each measure, and then as well as a total price to deliver the full project. And most importantly, what the energy and carbon savings would be resulting from their proposal. So the project team will set a date for when you need to have the first version of that outline solutions report submitted, and then we'll review that before having the first competitive dialogue meeting. And Joe's going to talk a little bit more now in a minute about why we use competitive dialogue and the broad structure it follows. But I suppose it's that outline solutions report that is the starting point for that first meeting. And through the process of having the meetings, we ask tenders then to go back and make updates to the document to reflect what we've talked about. So I might hand you back to Joe now, and you're going to talk a bit more generally about competitive dialogue.
Yep, thanks, Claudia. Yeah, so as you can see, there's quite a lot in the procurement phase. And it's worth saying that this is probably the most important phase for the facilitation team or the project implementation unit, whatever you want to call it. So it's quite important that if you're facilitating projects, that you have a good, reasonably good understanding of procurement, and um, have access to procurement professionals from the compliance side as well, so you don't get yourself in trouble. But touching quickly on the procurement directive, and I'm conscious of time now as well. There basically are a 6 procedures set out. Um, Open procedure and the restricted procedure are probably the two most common. And basically, the restricted procedure is the 2 stages. It's just the open stage separated into two. And the competitive dialogue that we use, which is number 4, is just a variation on this. It probably would be possible to use competitive procedure in negotiation. I'm not as familiar with it myself because that was introduced in the last directive update. But I'm going to focus very quickly on competitive dialogue and give you a sense of why we use it. So an important concept is that's very important for procurement strategy is the focus on outputs over inputs. So it's very important when we're structuring a procurement competition. If we want to get what we pay for, we want to achieve value for money, the focus needs to be on outputs. So we want our buildings to be low carbon, comfortable, safe environments, and that are cost efficient and energy efficient to operate. As you can see here on the left, in terms of inputs, there's lots of technologies that can help us make that happen. But how do we ensure that we get the results that we want? And essentially, the key, as we see it, is to link the contractor payments, the payment and profit, to the achieving of these outputs. That's kind of the core concept, one of the first ones. And then in terms of procurement, it's important to note that what we're buying is the contract. We're not buying the heat pump or the solar panels, we're buying the contract. So we're buying the output of the contract, which is the guaranteed energy savings or the guaranteed performance. We're buying the outputs, the technology, its design, its operation, its commissioning, all rolled into one. And how do we achieve this? It's through competitive dialogue. Reason why we use competitive dialogue is because it allows us to use an output specification. And competitive dialogue allows us to do this in a way that's not possible with the open or restricted procedures, which are the most common ones. So this is the key difference in what makes a competitive dialogue um, special and why we use it as much as possible. It's all about transferring the risk, the technical risk, to the contractor, as they are the technical expert and they're going to deal with it most cost effectively. And it's about achieving real measured CO2 savings and energy savings. And I think it's really important when we're putting heat pumps into existing buildings. What we're really trying to do is the idea is kind of keeping everybody in their risk making comfort zone. It's trying to ensure that we get the best project technically, financially, and that nobody's forced into making decisions that they're not comfortable with. Because ultimately, I think that's one of the biggest reasons we see for project delays is that people are faced with making a decision that they don't fully understand, but because they're a decision maker, they feel that they have to make it. So if we can get the balance and the risk structure right, we can get people making decisions that they're comfortable with. I mentioned so that competitive dialogue is a variation in the restricted procedure. It's this variation that makes it very important. So, like the open and restricted, as Grania mentioned, the first step is this pre-qualification. Just narrowing down the field to the contractors you feel are capable of doing the project you want to do. Once you have them shortlisted, and generally we try and get this down to no more than 3 contractors, we then go into the invitation to participate in competitive dialogue, as Grania explained. And the crucial difference here between the different models is we're not given a detailed specification here. We're given the client requirements, the output specification, what we want out of it. And it's a draft version at the start of it. And the goal of this process is to finalize those outputs and make sure everybody has a clear understanding of the goals of the project. Once you have that established, then you kind of almost go back into a more standard structure of the invitation to submit final tender and then contract award. So it's this focus on outputs that what clearly shifts, changes this whole process and shifts the risk. The dialogue phase itself takes place. Well, so the ESCO will go out and basically do their own audit. So we give them the full technical pack. And then from that, the ESCO will go and satisfy themselves, or the contract satisfy themselves as to how much of that they trust and what more they can add to it and where they see additional opportunities. So there's a little bit of duplication there, and we are working on that. But the idea is that the ESCO is kind of taking ownership over the material at that stage. So then once they've completed that audit, they'll come in. It's kind of an interview format. The ESCO will present their solutions. It's very important to have a clear agenda and treat everybody equally and have your full evaluation team. And the goal is just to kind of really tease out all those kind of outputs and get any assumptions or uncertainties out of the way. You can grade on that basis in those audit and those interviews, but generally we don't do, and we keep that to the invitation to tender. And what you're really trying to achieve is what Grania mentioned, is you're trying to finalize these outputs, and the outputs are presented in the client requirements. And for example, we might say something like, we always fix in the way we structure our projects the amount of money the local authority or the client will put forward. So that could be a maximum of 4.6 million. That depends on the financial modeling we're doing in the background. We'll also set a minimum overall energy savings target. It's still energy, even though the focus is decarbonisation, because energy is what we measure. That's what on the meter. It's what the measurement verification is set up. So we'll set a minimum target that must be achieved. And if you're talking about 50-60% energy savings, you're basically saying you have to put in a heat pump, and you're looking for other measures as well. But you're really trying to encourage the contractors to look for the synergies between the systems, to look for, it's not just about putting in new technology, it's about making sure that technology works in harmony together, that they're looking at other opportunities that might be out there, you know, um, based on, how the solar will work with the heat pump, or if there's batteries in place, or all of those things. We would set a contract period because that gives certainty. So you're kind of setting boundaries for any financial calculations there. And we also might have elements like no fossil fuels systems will considered, or you'll be setting obviously conditions for indoor air temperature or pool water temperature, or basically the outputs. So you know what kind of building you want to sit in, you want it low carbon, you don't necessarily know what's happening in the plant room, you're pushing that to the ESCO. Very quickly, I just wanted to throw this chart up. It's an example from our real projects in terms of timelines. So we had actually set up the framework for this Mid East region towards the end of 2024. But then we issued the technical file, or the invitation to participate in competitive dialogue went out in January for the first project and March for the second project. And we had gone through the whole process and got through the contract award in December for each. And I think that it can be quite a quick process, and now we're into detailed design and hopefully getting the works into those projects early this year. Coming to the end of the slides now, so bear with us. But very quickly wanted to touch on the concept of value for money as well. So this is one that I've been working in EPC now for over 10 years, and this, is it value for money? Is it not value for money? Are you paying a lot extra for the risk you're transferring? Is it not much cheaper just to, design it up yourself and keep all the savings? And so we wanted to basically to get somebody to look at this independently of Kadima, and we approached this company called Cosmos to who are a kind of a international cost consultancy and specialize a lot in decarbonisation projects. And we asked them to deliver a value for money assessment on one of our main projects, comparing traditional CWMF contracts against the performance contract. And plus this give an opinion on the idea of the cost ceiling, which I'll touch on in a moment. And now I've just literally copied and pasted some of the slides from Cosmos from our recent delivery seminar. So I hope that's okay. So basically, the core question was that does EPC represent good value for money? And then within that, there was five key questions of what alternatives are there to EPC? How does EPC financially compare? And the environmental comparison, the strategic alignment goals, and the conclusion. Now, I've only taken the last two here, but just to give you an idea of the results, and we'll hopefully be able to make a public version of this document in the future. We just haven't got around to it yet. But basically, the primary, or in terms of aligning with goals, they found that EPC is the most appropriate contract route, a contract choice for this goal for the local authority in question. That EPC pushes contractors hardest towards optimal solutions, and that EPC is equal to or better than alternatives on all comparison points. So in terms of value for money, it's equal if not better, and then but it also brings in the guarantee elements. So basically, the kind of main findings of the EPC was the recommended contract model in this case, and that it's the most appropriate and effective choice for the client's energy efficiency and value for money objectives, and it offers a robust guarantees, aligns incentives, and supports strategic goals better than traditional alternatives. So we felt that was kind of an important piece of work, and we just wanted to highlight it. And we will aim to publish a public version of it as well. And then very quickly, just touching on the last stage, which is a design. You may have noticed that, or it might be not, but we award our contracts based on a preliminary design and not a fixed financial offer. Or we order based on a preliminary design with a fixed financial offer, and then we go into a detailed design with a preferred bidder. And you can see earlier from the roles and responsibilities at this stage shift over to the ESCO, and we also have the energy efficiency design consultant represent the client, and we also have the cost consultant. The reason why we do it this way is from some early lessons, like from our very first projects collapsed. We thought we would just repeat what we had done in some very previous early energy efficiency based EPC projects, which were lower value. But with the focus on decarbonisation, resulted in higher project capital costs due to heat pumps, higher project risk as a result of this. And that all resulted in higher bid costs for the ESCOs, and they were basically not willing to take on that risk. So we were looking at ways that we could change this and make it more attractive. And what we have done is essentially we tried to move some of that the design risk into the second phase. So we restructured our procurement phase to kind of shift some of that burden from the ESCO. And now essentially you can see here we have the pre-qualification, invitation, competitive dialogue. And then in the invitation to tender, we have set out our clear requirements and also more importantly, probably assumptions and costing assumptions for the ESCO. So they don't have a detailed design, but they have a very solid preliminary design, and they paid a financial offer based on that. And that sets that idea of a cost ceiling. And then once we get into the contract phase, we essentially have three phases, which is a detailed design, or would be like a project development agreement in the private sector, works, and then services. And the agreement is that final costs cannot be greater than the tender costs. and we're working through that process now. That kind of brings us to the end, a little bit longer than we intended. We have a quick Slido we'd just like to try, just three questions. So I can't see anybody now, so I try and range. If you want to just see, can you log on to that? And then maybe Ellie, you might help us as well here in terms of seeing if people
There
are
is
getting on.
a joining link in the chat for if it's easier.
Okay, perfect. We basically have three questions. We asked an audience 3 years ago, and we're going to test them again, and we want to see how much, if things have changed at all. And then we'll get into the Q&A as well. And if anybody has any questions, hopefully we'll be able to unmute and ask them directly. If not, you can type them into the chat as well.
I have started by asking the first question. How do you perceive EPC? One word reaction to EPC.
Okay.
I can, if you'd stop sharing, Joe, I could share my screen here.
Right. I thought it'd be not complex and hard. I thought it'd be very easy after all of that. Glorious. I like that. Forward. I suppose one thing I see somebody's put in long there, like it I think on balance when you take all the stages in the traditional process and compare it to EPC, I think there are quite comparable in length. It's just that when you start procurement in EPC, you're starting at the very start of the project. But what we have found, particularly in the public sector, is that because it's kind of you're slowly advancing into the project, it really helps with decision making, and you're not asking people to make very difficult decisions or like as to go through.
If that's okay, I'll move on to the next question.
Yeah.
And that is, how is the organization planning to meet climate action targets for buildings?
Okay, it's quite interesting as well.
That's okay. I will flick to the last question as well. Have you considered using EPC?
Okay, that's quite interesting. It's quite good as well. Very good. That's quite
If
interesting. We just have to compare that to see how it compared
if
to before.
you're
Yeah.
if you're happy to stop the survey now, I will.
Yeah.
I will stop,
Everybody's
and I will stop sharing, so you can go to the questions and answers session.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll open it up to the floor. I feel like I've done enough talking now. So if anybody wants to type a chat or unmute yourself and yeah, comments, I'll pass it over to you. Everybody's very shy.
This is where we usually have a few Codema plants in an audience to get the ball rolling.
Joe, how's it going on? Brian Connolly.
Brian, how are you?
Not bad. How's yourself?
Good.
Thanks for that. Very informative. Just a quick one I have for you. During the initial stage of your assessment, during the state aid assessment, you said that there's a euro saved per ton of CO2, or euro spent per ton of CO2 saved element to your assessment. Two parts of the question. Is that brought in later on in any of your assessments as part of the assessing ESCO's solutions? And is there a industry best standard that you use?
Yeah, no, yeah, go ahead, Grania.
Honestly, so the state aid assessment is separate, but I presented it in the same Pathfinder stuff. So it's in the project selection matrix. I think I mentioned it. What's there is the euro invested per ton of CO2 saved annually. So that's not a good measure because that's not the whole project. You know, these projects should last for a number of years and not one. It's not something we score, Jan. And if we were going to use it as a scoring criteria, I would have to tell you in the invitation to submit final tender. So if you're not seeing any reference to it there, we can't score you on that figure. But I suppose it is something that the infrastructure guidelines makes us look at in terms of a local authority if they're going to spend money on this. We have to be looking at things like how it compares to the shadow price of carbon. So I think at the moment the shadow price of carbon is about it's 350 euro. I think it was 330 last year per ton of CO2 saved. And there's a table of that in the infrastructure guidelines in one of the appendices. So we'll do an analysis, and that's one of the things kind of Cosmos would have looked at in that report on euro invested per ton of CO2 saved, but the whole project, not for 1 year.
No bother. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think on the second point there, Brian, it would be really interesting to have a sense from the market of what exactly what is value for money, you know, because obviously it has changed, and we saw a big change after the Ukraine war, and you know, we do as Grandis as try and compare it to the shadow price of carbon, but it's kind of a work in progress. But I think it's a very important indicator for these projects, and that's where you'll often see where you can't justify large fabric interventions. And that can be controversial, and maybe you're making a choice to run a heat pump less efficiently because it represents better value for money on that scale. Counterintuitively, but
Yeah, no, completely agree. But yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah.
All right, thanks, man. I think we had one on the chat from Shane. How do you deal with partial failure to achieve targets at the end of the M&V period? So basically, that's the way the contract is structured. Is that let's say, for argument's sake, there was €100,000 of savings over a year, and the way the Irish contractor or the Philip Lee contract is structured, the first slice, the guarantee, comes off and goes to the local authority. So if the contractor had guaranteed €20,000 of that 100, no matter what happens, 20,000 goes to the local authority, and then the ESCO gets the difference. So if they fail to achieve the savings, then essentially their monthly payments reduce. So there's an automatic feedback mechanism there. And generally, I often look as probably the accountant who notices first time sometimes that something has gone wrong if things are not being monitored. So there's a constant feedback there. Not achieving 90%. In terms of the 90% of heat from the renewables, that's something we would be monitoring separately to make sure that there wasn't overuse of gas, or especially where we have biovalent systems. But again, we've taken a very pragmatic approach in our buildings, so we are generally looking at cascading heat pump systems and full gas backup, because there's a lot of risks here still in transitioning across with all the buildings. Anybody else?
Hi Joe, it's Damien here from Alternative Heat. Just kind of half on the back of what Brian was asking. Obviously, the mixture of sites and the mixture of the kind of quality of the current installations and life cycles. Is there any scope to be bringing in kind of avoided costs in? Because obviously it makes a big difference to your carbon cost and also to your payback period. Say there's some sites you'll go to and you're basically very minimal amount of works to be done, but there's some that need a lot of enabling works because there's end of life services and different upgrades that need done that would be needing done anyway, regardless of what the client was doing. It's just wondering, is there any way of kind of incorporating that just to have a cleaner view of the sites?
Yeah, I suppose we do try and work out as much of that as possible during the kind of competitive dialogue. But yeah, there are kind of enabling works. The goal there, Damien, would be to identify them and include them as fixed costs for all bidders, essentially, and just isolate the other bits. But you don't always catch all of them, and then sometimes you catch some of them later. But generally, we're able to deal with that process. But it is something where we're constantly learning as we're going through with this as well, and they. I think the shift to focus on decarbonisation has changed changed things a bit more than I appreciated when we were putting contracts out first. But that kind of answers your question in a roundabout way.
Yeah, spot on. Thanks, Joe.
Question in the chat there, Joe. For private entrants, there's a significant challenge with integrating systems that will cover battery storage and heat storage and CHP and demand peaking. So maybe just more of a comment. I suppose just to mention battery storage is something that isn't actually covered by Pathfinder at the moment. So we are looking at different ways, I suppose, that the private investment can cover different components of a cost. Anything you want to add on that, Joe?
No, I think that's fairly well covered. I think I was going to say something now, and it's just slipped out of my mind. So if there aren't any more questions, we will be making the delivery project itself was obviously it's part of a European funded project, and the official end is at the end of May. So we're busy finalizing all our documents now and getting everything up on site. So everything that we have discussed today will be available for people to use and hopefully in your own projects. If you have, we're always open to feedback and comment and how we can improve the process. It's not perfect, but I'd be quite confident that we're hopefully on the right track with it. So if we have no more, anybody else, any final comments? Oh, do we have somebody? Sorry, back in the chat again. Sorry, Patrick, do you want to maybe unmute and maybe explain?
Yeah, here we go. Hello, this is Patrick Leonard. You can hear me okay, yeah?
Can indeed, Patrick. How are you?
Hi, very good, very good. Yeah, just very quickly, for private entrants, and I know this is mainly geared towards the public sector, from what I gather. So
Yes.
it's just that one of the main challenges and ongoing challenges is this is what I find with these projects is that the thing is that some projects are in between sort of industrial and domestic, and they would be a particular use case. And what I have, I mean, and this is an ongoing thing for a number of years, it's cropped up, is these hot room yoga studios. They really peak on power, and they're normally located in areas that are sensitive to high demand. And what's happening is that, for instance, an off-the-shelf AHU isn't really configured to deliver heat at 40 or 50 centigrade, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then, as I say, integrating then sources of power. So a lot of these buildings would be somewhat industrial in nature. They would be older industrial, therefore they would have asbestos roofs. And it would be nice to be able to integrate the solar panel in with the roof. And then, but you see, the thing is, if a solar, I'm going to take a quick canter through this because I don't want to, I'll just keep it high level. So if we've got an off-the-shelf, say, solar provider, right, they'll generally provide solar panels, and they provide the storage, and they'll provide the installation, right? But it would be integrating that with, say, a CHP unit and a heat storage unit, something like a sand battery or something like that, or a hot salt. So what I'm doing is I'm just framing the major challenge isn't so much the components that can be purchased, but the initial finding out what works and configuration for that would have to be prototyped, because it's a quite a non-standard application of these technologies. In
Yeah.
that yeah, that's, I mean, I just leave it there at that, I think, without
Yeah.
saying too much.
So what you're kind of touching on is essentially why we take the approach we do and why we focus on the outputs. So I suppose first of all, we have developed this with the public sector in mind, the public procurement, but
Yes.
we are looking at projects now to very much take this into the light industrial and SME sector. So I think
Okay.
there's real opportunities there. But what you're kind of describing there is the kind of the challenge when looking at all the technologies and all the options out there, and what you have, and the difficulty, from a building owner when you're trying to figure out what's right for you. And that's why we try to structure everything based on the outputs. So what you want out of it. You want
Yes.
you want your studio, and you want your lower energy consumption, whatever. There are
Yes.
options. So generally, when you put those options and you go to the contractor, and the idea would be, the ESCO is essentially a main contractor bringing all those subcontractors together, the solar specialist, the battery specialist, the other. And once you ask them to basically have some skin in the game, essentially share some of if there's savings there or benefit, and share it with you, you generally start to find out very quick what's a real technology and what's a real option and what isn't. And
Right.
that's the purpose of the process. You said, this is our end goal. There's savings to be made here. I'm going to share that with you, but you have to take technical risk here, and then you'll find
Mhm.
out whether a molten battery is really an option or not, or
Yes.
and that's the whole crux of the process here. So it's to try and drive innovation, but sensible innovation, if you know what I mean. Now, if you want to get in, if you
Yeah.
really innovation is your goal, then you can design that into the process, but then you have to be realistic about your risk sharing then.
Yes. Okay. Well, yeah, that does make sense, because no, it's just that, you see, this has evolved since 2004, when I was first involved, with these things. And at the time, it was it would have been battery storage would have been the big one. Now
Mm.
it's and then the special types of insulation, and then obviously, I won't go into it in too much depth, but that would be as you're saying, that there seems to be some allocation for prototyping, and there is a realistic approach to the fact that some cases will require a level of risk associated with that, and that can be built into the overall, as you say, the overall way that these projects are being managed.
Yep.
Would that be
That's
right?
it, yeah. Essentially, it comes down to your contract, essentially. I think that's the most important. And whether you're doing public or private sector procurement, I think you always need to start with that contract. They're the rules of engagement, essentially, yeah.
Well, it's just that, it's just the kind of the stone wall in some ways was always the risk involved in pushing some of these technologies a little bit outside of their normal envelope, and then because I think it's something like it's a sudden 40 or 50 kilowatt load that comes on quite quickly, and if that's in a sensitive area, etc. We've covered that. Anyway, that's great.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
Is there anybody else before we close up? No, then. So thank you all for joining this morning and sticking with us, and we will share the presentation to the audience after. So, okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye now.
Thank you.